All right, eel nerds. I want to talk to you about a very scary true story about an economy and the lessons I learned from it and how it impacts my investing philosophy. I try to look like that king in that picture there. My beard has a long way to go. Well, let's get into the agenda. We are at 358 subscribers. Thank you for your support. If you're new, please use the playlist. It starts from an elementary level in fixed income up to this episode. And most importantly, please remember that I have no magical powers of prediction. I'm often wrong, so make sure you do your own homework. Well, so we are going to look at four parts in this agenda. The first is to take a look at the temperature of the market. And then I'm going to tell you about my true economy scary story. And then my thesis of what that means and where I'm going to go. And I'll share with you my trades. Well, my returns for the last year are about 6.18%. That is after I have withdrawn all of the expenses for my living, and also it is state tax free. So I'm happy with my performance. It's not a NASDAQ that, puts on 20, 30, 40%. And so good for you if all your wealth was invested in the NASDAQ and you're smiling your way to the bank. I just grew my portfolio by a mere 6% after tax and after expenses. All right. Let me also remind you that my portfolio has been predominantly in fixed income. Right about now, as we start approaching the election, is when I am starting to move into equities, but still in a very minuscule way, 1%, something like that in equities. But I am adding every day and every week. In terms of time to maturity, you may know that I'm in very, very short terms for various reasons. And having said all of that, let me tell you about the scary story that I've been alluding to. And the scary story, and you can see a whole bunch of blind people following a blind king, and that is what I was going to talk to you about. Before I go any further, I want to make sure you know that what I'm about to share is not tax advice, it's not investment advice, I am not a wealth management advisor, and I have no product or politics to pitch. All right? Let's give credit where it is due, and I will put all the links in my presentation as well in the YouTube video. Number one, I want to make sure that I'm not here secretly sending some message about the United States. The economy I'm going to discuss is not the United States. And a good amount of it is from a very, very nice article called How a Country Goes Bankrupt in 10 Steps, Gradually and Then Suddenly by John Rubino. Well, we're going to call this magical country Zendaya, and I will tell you who that is later on. Zendaya is a country that is wealthy, it is doing so well, it's a real country, and it had a little bit of debt 30 years ago. And when I say a little bit of debt, 40% of GDP, which, you would look at and laugh at today, 40% of GDP, very few countries are even there. They were there in 1991, a wonderful, prosperous country. And they started adding more and more debt, and they reached 100% in the year 2000. Ouch, not nice, but still in today's standards, 100%. I suppose we can live with it. Now, interest rates in 2000 in this country was 6%. They said, hey, we are overheating. Our GDP is growing, but we don't want this, stuff happening, so we're gonna try and figure out what to do with the 6% interest rates, which the US now is at 5.3. And the challenge with 5.3% or 6%, this is in 2000, is you have to pay a lot of money in interest payments. To service that debt costs a lot of money. And so the government, a very sophisticated government, sat there and said, what do we need to do to decrease the debt burden? And they came up with a wonderful solution. They said, here's how we're going to fix debt issues. Number one, we're going to drop interest rates. That is going to do two things. It's going to increase the GDP, which decreases the debt to GDP ratio, and how wonderful it is also going to decrease the debt service payments. We decrease the numerator, we decrease the denominator. Amazing, the right solution. So they started dropping interest rates, chop, 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 and the new interest rate was zero. How about that? 0% interest rate. What does a 0% interest rate do? It stimulates the economy, I guess, decreases debt payments. Let's see what it did. Between 2000 and the year 2020, the interest rates came from 6 to 0. And so companies said, hey, I can keep borrowing. My interest payments barely make a blip. And so companies started loading on what is called private credit. So if you were to look at the debt to equity ratio of companies in Zendaya, you will see that their debt to equity ratios kept skyrocketing. And here is the only problem, if you keep borrowing more and more money, even at a lower percentage rate, your payments are a big number. So they couldn't really hire more people. So jobs did not grow. Their debt service was cheap, debt grew. And they were hoping somehow everybody would buy their products and their economy would grow. Small problem, that did not happen either. Their deficits actually went up, not down, in a lower interest rate environment. So the sophisticated government said, okay, I know what we need to do here. There is a clear solution. If we don't have a lot of job growth, it's a temporary problem. We've dropped interest rates. The economy is going to get stimulated in a matter of time. In the meanwhile, we're just going to print more money and make it easy for people to get loans, and they just need to tide by until the economy picks up. That sounds sensible to me, I guess. And so their debt to GDP ratio goes to 262. Well, that sounds like a good solution. Well, here is the only problem. The currency crashed. Well, if your currency crashed because you were using up, a whole bunch of debt, then I know the idea. There is a very easy way to perk up your currency. Guess what that is? You just need to increase your interest rate. You dummy, you have a 0% interest rate. So if you increase your interest rate, money will flow into the company because your 1/4% or 0.5% or whatever you plan to pay is now money that you can get. So your bonds will increase. I see where this goes. So wait, one more small thing happened. True country, by the way. Uh, Inflation, which became negative in 2021 and barely registered on the clock in 2020, inflation suddenly starts shooting up. Now remember, this is not COVID inflation. This is inflation because they started increasing the interest rates right alongside a time where their debt to equity ratio is very high. And so they said, let me give everybody some money. We all need to get out of the jam we are in. This big chunk is COVID. And when they came out of COVID, they didn't have inflation. And then they said, I know what we're going to do. We're going to increase interest rates. And when inflation strikes an economy, it is a bear. Here's what it did. The country has a very low interest rate, and their currency is starting to crash. Their debt to GDP is through the roof. So the government said, I know what to do. This is a logical step. Other countries have done bailouts. I'm going to go buy my own stock market. I'm going to buy stocks in it. And I'm also going to buy my own bonds. That should all be good. And here is the problem. When the country started doing it, the interest rate was 0.5%, but inflation is 4.5%. So even though you're getting paid 0.5%, you are sinking 4.5%. So owning this country's bond cost you 4%. Well, what would you do if you're a good citizen of Zendaya? You're going to say, wait a second, I put $100 in the bank account at the beginning of the month. It's 96 at the end of the year. No. I don't want 0.5% interest rate and 4.5 inflation. I want to look around the world and see where else I can make a higher interest rate. The good people of Zendaya bought US treasuries. Thank you, good people of Zendaya. Except it had a terrible effect on their own currency. It crashed their currency by 30%. Well, if you are the federal bank of Zendaya, what are you going to do? You're going to say, I'm going to fight. I am going to increase interest rates. When I do that, our people are going to bring the money back into Zendaya and our currency is going to improve. I know exactly what I need to do, and they increase the interest rates. Well, when you increase the interest rate and your debt to GDP ratio is 262%, going just from 0 to 0.5, do the simple math, is going to suck out 1.3% of your GDP. What do you think the growth rate of big countries are these days? The developed economies grow only at 1%, 2% maybe. If half of the new value created by your economy has to be sucked out to pay interest, then there is nothing left for infrastructure, for stimulating the economy. And so this economy started suffering. Okay, GDP starts falling into negative territory. Your interest rate is already 0.5%. If you increase it, you're going to burden the GDP even more. What do you do if you're Zendaya's government? Maybe we need to decrease interest rates. You see the death spiral this creates? You can't afford a high interest rate, even a nominal interest rate with a high debt to GDP ratio. Decreasing it is going to send everybody running away from your currency. Printing more money in order to address that will crash the currency even more. And if you sat here thinking Zendaya must be some God-forlorn country, poor them, maybe we should be nice to them and see what we can do. And if you thought it's an unsophisticated small country, guess again. Zendaya is not a country with a tiny GDP. It's not a country that doesn't have a seat at the big tables. Zendaya is steps from implosion, and it is Japan. That is a big economy. It's actually the number 3 economy in the world. And you see this? Japan's GDP grows at 1%, but it's costing them 1.3% to stay afloat. And so Japan is going deeper and deeper into a hole. Thank goodness the US can do a lot of good things. And, at least US and China are stable. Let me do some very quick checking. Oops, what's that? Well, US debt as a percentage of GDP during the great financial crisis was much, much higher. Thankfully, we're not at 170 anymore. And this is 2016, we are at 150. This is an article by Wolf Street. I'll post the links on the YouTube channel as well. And in 2024, private debt, which is the debt to equity ratio of private companies and anybody that is not the government, is at 150%. And the government debt to GDP ratio is at 126%. Hey, I don't want you to start thinking about any other country we've been talking about. I just want you to remember we're at 126% and our interest is about 5.3%. Don't draw any parallels, all right? Now, where does China stand in all of this? They must have a roaring tiger economy. Let's do a quick check. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? China had already crossed the 200s by 2016, and it gets worse. They are off the charts. They are at 286% debt to GDP, and their own government, private credit, is over 200. So China is looking even worse because they borrowed a lot of money to put into real estate infrastructure. And you may have read about China's real estate crashes. When that crashes, then your debt to GDP ratio becomes worse. Now, China is in a position of having to print more money and chasing its own tail. I don't like where the Chinese government is, the US government is. You know who I think is fiscally responsible? It's got to be Europe. Let me quickly check Europe. Oh, wait a second. That doesn't look too good either. Europe is at 170, even worse than the US. And you sit back here and go, what gives? Everybody is spending more than they are making. And if we were to put this in a chart across the entire world and taking many of the bigger economies into account, everybody started off right around 2008 after the great financial crisis. The US had to borrow a lot, and as did many other countries. Unfortunately for Canada and China, things did not take a quick turn. Look at Canada. Canada takes off and hasn't turned back. The Canadian total debt to GDP is now 104. Their private sector, these are Canadian banks, these are Canadian companies, their debt is 269% on par or slightly worse than even China. And so, what does all of this mean in terms of where the world is? 170 is nothing to be proud of. 150 is nothing to be proud of. Even 100 is not anything to be proud of. To sit here and say a debt to GDP ratio of 100 is good is terrible. We should all be striving for a lower debt. What that means in terms of investing means, it puts us in a terrible, terrible place. If I were to look at the US and say, where does the US stand with respect to the rest of the world? I hate to say it, the US is the one-eyed king in the land of the blind. And that looks like that king here, even though that king only has one eye, it looks good. That king looks good. That's because the rest of the world is blind. Where do we go from here? I still am going to stick to my filters, and I'm investing for a 10, 15-year horizon. I'm going to stay on defensive. I'm only going to make value investments because in a world where debt is the ticket, I am not interested in buying discretionary stocks with a lot of growth. I am not interested in companies that don't have a lot of cash flow. I'm going to look at things that are predominantly made in the US because of currency type situations. And if there are US companies that have high foreign revenue, that's good. I certainly will not be buying companies that take raw materials from other countries and sell into the US. Now, you do you, but that is my philosophy. So where does this one-eyed king lead an otherwise blind world into the future? That informs my trades, in terms of what I buy. It's a whole bunch of treasuries, they sell, they mature, I turn around and buy it. Some of my FHLB bonds got called. I'm so sad about that. In terms of equities, I am staying true to what I bought before. This is Bungie. I talked to you about them. They store wheat. Orcat is a drone manufacturer. And aside from that, I've just kept true to my holdings. I've really not bought or sold anything. Orcat leads my portfolio in terms of gains. Calmain Foods had a fabulous last couple of weeks. Check them out. And so food, energy, healthcare, very, very defensive. I've taken a beating with the chip stocks, but I'm just going to sit tight for now and not buy them. That is me. You do you. And thank you for watching Yield Nerd.